On Tuesday, June 4th, 1996, the first official flight of the crewless Ariane 5 rocket, carrying with it 4 very expensive scientific satellites, ended after only 37 seconds in a giant ball of smoke and fire. The failure of the Ariane 501 rocket was due to a simple software bug, a computer getting its math wrong and essentially getting overwhelmed by a number way bigger than it originally expected. In more recent years, similar number errors have been responsible for a series of disasters and mishaps, destroying rockets and cargo, making space probes go missing, and sending missiles off target. So how is it possible that supercomputers like those on rockets and space technology can get confused by numbers in such a relatively simple way? Imagine trying to represent a value of 104,942 on an odometer that has a limit of 99,999. The counter would count the number all the way up to its maximum value, and then roll over to 0 and continue to count the remaining number, 4,942. This is the same type of inaccuracy that caused the explosion of the 1996 Ariane 5 rocket. This type of error is called integer overflow, basically meaning that numbers are too big to be stored in a computer system, and in the case of the Ariane 5, can potentially, cause malfunction. An investigation of the Ariane flight found that a process left over from the older generations of rockets, Ariane 4, had captured an unexpectedly high reading for the sideways velocity of the faster Ariane 5 rocket, and the software simply couldn't handle this high number. A self-destruct sequence was then initiated, and a couple of seconds later, I don't think I really need to explain the rest.
Tous les paramètres propulsifs sont normaux et la trajectoire est normale.
These types of glitches can emerge and cause a problem surprisingly frequently. Somewhere in between August 11th and August 14th of 2013, NASA lost communication with its Deep Impact Space Probe with a similar integer overflow error. And more recently, it was reported that certain Boeing 787 aircraft may run into a similar issue. The control unit managing the amount of power given to these kinds of planes' engines will automatically enter into a fail-safe function which could potentially shut down the engines, even in mid-flight. This could occur if the engines are left on for more than 248 days. According to the FAA, a counter in the control unit's software will overflow after this period of time. 248 days, when counted in 100ths of a second, is equal to the number 2,147,483,647, which just so happens to be the maximum positive value that can be stored on a 32-bit signed register, which is installed on many modern computer systems. For comparison, the Ariane 5 rocket used a 16-bit register, which is much smaller and only capable of storing a maximum value of 32,767. There are a lot of numbers, an infinite amount, yet why do we choose so limited storage spaces for them? Well, the reason has to do with how efficient we want computer systems to be. Computer systems have traditionally demanded efficiency in literally everything they're built to do. Storage space used to be much more costly than it is today, and attempting to process larger values took longer. If you kept to certain limits, software would run more smoothly for longer periods of time. This is the reason for limiting the amount of storage space on computer systems. Rocket guidance systems do a ton of very critical math in a very short amount of time, which is why the computer software in and outside the rocket has to be so limited. The only problem is, these limitations aren't always seen ahead of time as problematic, as was learned in the case of the Ariane 5. Another famous example of an integer overflow problem was when the popular music video Gangnam Style literally broke the YouTube view counter. The view counter had apparently only been programmed to count to 2,147,483,647, which once again is the maximum value of a 32-bit signed register. After fixing the problem, the new maximum view count is well over 9 quintillion. Yep, we definitely got a while. 33.87 years before the launch of the Ariane 5, the uncrewed Mariner 1 was launched by an Atlas Agena rocket from Cape Canaveral in Florida. Shortly after liftoff, errors in communication between the rocket and its ground-based guidance systems caused the rocket to veer off course, and it had to be destroyed for safety purposes. The launch of the Mariner 1 was scheduled for the early morning of July 21st, 1962, but several delays caused by trouble in the range safety command system delayed the countdown until 11:33 p.m. that night. At 2:20 a.m., just 80 minutes before launch, a blown fuse in the range safety systems caused the launch to be cancelled. The countdown was then reset that night and proceeded with several holds, planned and unplanned, from 11:08 p.m. through the early morning of the next day. At 9:21 a.m. on July 22, 1962, Mariner 1 with its Atlas Agena rocket lifted off from Pad 12 at Cape Canaveral. Soon after launch, the rocket booster began drifting northeast of its planned trajectory. Corrective steering commands were sent to the rocket, but instead it continued to drift off course. At 9:26 a.m., just 6 seconds before the rocket's second stage was scheduled to separate from the Atlas Stage 1, at which point destruction of the rocket would be impossible, a range safety officer ordered the rocket to initiate a self-destruct sequence, which it definitely did. In total, the flight lasted for 294.5 seconds. Because of its gradual rather than sharp deviation from its planned trajectory, engineers assumed that the problems lay in the flight equations loaded onto the computer which guided the Atlas Agena rocket from the ground during its ascent. After 5 days of post-flight analysis, engineers determined that the malfunction on Mariner 1 was caused by a bug in the guidance computer logic combined with a hardware failure. Somewhere deep in the handwritten guidance equations contained the symbol R, which stood for radius. The problem with this innocent-looking letter R is that it should have had a line over it called an R-bar, indicating smoothing or averaging of the data provided by an earlier calculation. But the bar was missing, and so the computer programs based on those equations were incorrect. This was not an error in the programming, but an error in the specification, assuming the software worked from an earlier rocket. But this is okay, because in the case of the Ariane 5 and the Mariner 1, their engineers were able to learn from this mistake. In total, the Ariane 5 rocket family launched successfully 106 times, and the Mariner 2, after the destruction of the Mariner 1, was able to complete the first ever flyby of Venus, which was Mariner 1's primary goal. And once again, thanks for watching, and Happy New Year.